The night air is quiet, filled only by the ambient noise of animals and trees creaking in the wind. People have retreated to their homes, closing them up tight against the dangers the darkness brings. Soldiers keep a sharp eye out as they stand watch, wary of the night. For a while, all seems calm. Animals and people alike settle into quiet rest. But then, they hear it. Closer than they expect to hear anything, the soldiers hear a faint whistling. Something is moving through the air, and it's getting closer. But the soldiers have been warned about this, and they spring into action. They immediately scan the night sky, using whatever lights they have on hand. Their beams catch on 2 distant shapes far above and approaching fast. That's not what they were warned about, though. The whistling grows louder, and the soldiers more frantic in their search. Still, they can't find the source of the noise, but though they can't see it, they know what it means. The night witches have come. Welcome back to the Mightier Pen, where I share narrative tips for the story-driven DM. Because while the pen can be mightier than the sword, it only becomes so with training. I'm Kate, an editor by trade, a writer by hobby, and a DM by default. Today, we're stealing from history as we take a closer look at the Night Witches. That story I started with, it probably sounds like something out of a fantasy book, right? What if I told you it was true? Before we jump into adapting things for D&D, let's have a little, or a long, history lesson. In 1939, Germany invaded Poland, triggering a Second World War that would last until 1945. Prior to invasion, Germany made several political moves, including a non-aggression treaty with the Soviet Union, promising the two nations would not take military action against each other for a span of 10 years, which would allow them to wage war on one front without worrying about a threat on the other. Over the next year, Germany would quietly expand their influence over Europe while convincing the wider world that there wasn't really a war going on. They slowly built up momentum, occupying large swaths of the continent with little to no resistance. And as the war to the east went smoothly, Germany's attention turned west and north, to the Soviet Union. Breaking the non-aggression pact, Germany enacted Operation Barbarossa on June 2, 1941, in a 3-pronged attack involving over 3 million troops spread over 1,800 miles. Germany invaded the USSR. On the first day alone, they shot down over 1,000 Soviet aircrafts, and by the end of August, troops were within 220 miles of Moscow. In a costly move, Germany decided to delay their march on Moscow in order to focus on the more southern Ukraine. By the time they had returned their focus to the capital city, it was October, and Soviet forces had rallied. 1 million troops and 1,000 tanks now stood between them and their objective. They fought the Germans to a standstill, the march stalling out a mere 12 miles from Moscow. The German forces had been banking on quick, decisive action to win the day, and they had failed to set up appropriate supply lines to survive the harsh northern winter. A surprise counterattack in early December set the Germans in retreat. But the USSR wasn't going to let the insult and broken treaty go lightly. They threw themselves into the war effort, and that's where our story really begins. The USSR was not operating from a place of strength. They'd had no reason to believe that their ally would break the treaty and turn on them, so their defenses weren't built up. They hadn't spent years building up their troops and improving their equipment the way Germany had. And in the initial invasion, they lost a good deal of their best resources. Certainly, they lost an unfortunate number of troops, tanks, and planes, best or otherwise. But they had managed to buy themselves some time, and they didn't waste any of it. Marina Raskova was the Soviet Air Force's first female navigator. She was well known for that and for holding several long-distance flight records. Marina began receiving letters from women across the Soviet Union who wanted desperately to help in the war effort. They were women deeply affected by the war, but who had been turned down when they tried to enlist or otherwise get involved. Eventually, bolstered by their interest, Marina requested that the government allow her to form an all-female fighting squadron, and on October 8, 1941, she was granted permission to create 3. These women would not only fly planes, but they were cleared to return fire, making them the first women to officially engage in combat. Applications flooded in. From the over 2,000 hopeful women, Marina selected 400 people per squadron. They mostly fell between the ages of 17 and 26. Over the following months, the women underwent rigorous and highly compressed training. Each of the recruits was required to train as pilot, navigator, maintenance, and ground crew. Their uniforms, including the boots, were hand-me-downs from the men. Their planes were outdated biplanes, crop dusters never meant to see combat, made of plywood and canvas that provided no protection from bullets or the extreme cold at altitude. They had no parachutes, no radar, no guns, and no radio. The women were expected to navigate with paper maps, compasses, and flashlights. But that didn't slow them down in the least. On June 28, 1942, the 588th made their debut. They flew only at night, 2 women to a plane, a pilot in front and a navigator behind, generally in groups of 3 planes. Bombs were loaded, 1 strapped under each wing, and the ladies would set out. 2 of the planes would fly higher, catching attention and marking the target with a flare. The 3rd plane would come in lower. The pilot would time things just right, idle the engine, glide in over the target, and manually drop a bomb. Then the planes would switch places and make more runs. Once all the bombs were dropped, the group would head back to their base, reload, and head out again. They often executed between 8 and 18 missions a night. In total, the 588th flew over 30,000 missions, about 800 per pilot. 30 pilots were lost, and 24 were awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. They were the most highly decorated unit of the Soviet Air Force. When she died in January of 1943, Marina Raskova was given World War II's first state funeral. I could go on even more about these incredible and brave women, but I don't want to veer too far off topic, so let's circle back to how their story can inspire ours. First of all, the women of the 588th are a perfect example of unconventional solutions to pressing problems. When war knocked on their doorstep, these brave women insisted on taking action. When their boots were too small, they stuffed them with torn-up bedding. Their planes were the furthest things from fighter planes. Well, it turned out those slow little aircrafts were perfect for outmaneuvering other planes, which were too fast to make the twists and turns needed for technical reasons involving stall speeds that I fully admit to not understanding. When a scarcity in equipment led to their planes lacking radio and navigation, they learned to navigate by paper and realized that the lack of electrical equipment made them harder to spot on radar. Add in that the bombs weighed their small aircrafts down quite a bit, meaning they needed to fly at lower altitudes, and they quickly realized that night flights were their best and really only bet. In fact, night flights proved to be their signature, and part of the reason they were so effective. Plenty of pilots on both sides of the war were doing night raids, as cities were targets, and they were lit up at night like beacons, and dark made it hard to find and shoot down moving targets. But these ladies took it a step further. Because they weren't just dangerous flyers, they became legends. That brings me to my second point, the power of reputation and rumor. When I said earlier that we were talking about the Night Witches, I wasn't giving the 588th a fantasy equivalent nickname. I was being very literal. The signature move of the 588th, as I mentioned before, involved idling the plane's engine and gliding over their target. This produced an eerie whistling or whooshing noise in an otherwise silent sky, a terrifying prelude to an explosion that German soldiers quickly began to fear. It reminded the Germans of stories of witches on broomsticks, only reinforced when they discovered that the pilots were all women. They called them Nachthexen, night witches. Rumors began to spread. Some people thought the pilots were criminals, master thieves who were punished by being sent to the front lines. Others feared the pilots had been giving some sort of experimental injection that allowed them to see normally in the dark. I guess even in our non-magical world, people are still obsessed with claiming to have dark vision. It illustrates the interesting way in which legends and tales can influence the way people perceive and interact with the world. People have a tendency to frame things, especially the unknown, in terms they're more familiar with. The unknown, especially when tied to legends, can also invoke emotions, especially fear. The Night Witches were an incredibly successful group, and the more successful they were, the more their reputation grew. They dropped more than 23,000 pounds of bombs, and by the end of the war, any pilot who shot down a Night Witch was awarded an Iron Cross. It's pure speculation on my part, but the Night Witch's final flight was on May 4th, 1945, a mere 3 days before Germany's official surrender. And that last flight, it took them less than 40 miles from Berlin. Coincidence? Probably, but I can't help but wonder if that proximity was a factor in the decision. So, what are some things you can steal from the legend of the Night Witches? 1. Ambushes are a great tool in your DM toolbox. Take some inspiration from the 588th. Try a night ambush or an unseen threat from above. Bonus points if you can weave in an ominous warning noise. 2. Give your players practical obstacles to overcome and reward them for creative solutions. No matter how much you plan, you can never predict exactly what your players are going to do, and in my opinion, the game is all the better for the unexpected. I say encourage that out-of-the-box type of thinking and see where it might lead. 3. Think about local legends. How can you weave them into your game, and what might they really be about? Does a small village near the mountains have stories of storms personified that shake the ground with every step and hurl lightning at mortals who dare to look upon them? Maybe it's a territorial storm giant. Also, think about your player's party. How do people in the game world think and talk about them? What sort of rumors might follow them around? 4. Play around with a fantasy air corps. Maybe the City Watch has a small group of winged soldiers, or an army has a company of Pegasus, Griffin, or other flying creature riders. Maybe you take the Night Witch's name literally and create a company of broomstick-riding magicians, either as friends or foes for your party to encounter. If this episode and the Night Witches has sparked an idea, drop it in the comments or send it my way. I love hearing how other DMs tell their stories. I'm Kate, and this has been The Mightier Pen. Keep honing those storytelling skills, and may you always take your enemies by surprise.